The first snow of November came without warning. It always did, up here. Miriam Caldwell stood at the window of the small stone cottage and watched the flakes fall like ash against the pine trees. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass, not to feel the cold, but to feel something. Anything to remind her that she was still here. Still breathing. Still occupying space in a world that had, very quietly, very politely, stopped noticing her. She was 76 years old. Her daughter had called 3 weeks ago. A short call. The kind with too many sighs and careful pauses, where the real conversation lives in what nobody says. "Mom, we just think the mountain air will be good for you. After everything. After everything." That phrase had been following Miriam around for 8 months like a dog she never asked for. After Dad passed. After the hospital stay. After you stopped eating properly. After you became, and nobody said this word, but Miriam heard it anyway, difficult. She hadn't unpacked the second suitcase yet. She wasn't sure she was going to. Outside, the snow kept falling. The nearest town was 11 miles of winding road away. The nearest neighbor, a retired forester named Hollis, lived somewhere down the eastern ridge. She'd seen smoke from his chimney once. Maybe twice. She turned from the window and looked at the empty room. This is where they put me, she thought. This is where I end. She had not always been easy to love. Miriam understood that about herself, even if understanding it didn't make it hurt any less. She had been a geology professor for 31 years at a university in Vermont. Sharp. Exacting. The kind of teacher students feared and respected in equal measure. She had published papers, attended conferences, argued passionately about tectonic drift at dinner parties. She had been present, loudly, stubbornly present, in every room she entered. And then Harold died on a Tuesday in March. Not dramatically. Not in some way that gave her a story to tell at his funeral. He simply didn't wake up. 61 years of marriage, and he slipped out of life while she slept beside him, so gently she hadn't even stirred. She'd only realized when she reached for his hand and found it cold. After that, the rooms at home became unbearable. Every doorway held a memory. Every chair had a shape to it that was his shape. She stopped sleeping in the bedroom. She stopped eating at the table. She started leaving the television on at night, not to watch it, but because the voices made the silence feel less like a verdict. Her daughter, Patricia, visited when she could. But Patricia had 3 teenagers and a job in corporate law and a husband who traveled, and the particular guilt of someone who loves their mother but cannot afford, emotionally or logistically, to carry her. Patricia's love was real. Miriam never doubted that. But love, she had learned, could be real and still be rationed. The mountain cottage had been Harold's idea, decades ago. They'd talked about retiring there. Hiking. Watching the seasons change. Reading on the porch. It was a dream they'd been saving for, the way you save a good bottle of wine for a special occasion, until one day you realize the occasion never came and the wine has turned. Now the cottage was Miriam's alone, and there was nothing romantic about it. The first 2 weeks, she barely moved. She would wake before dawn, make tea she didn't finish, sit in the wooden chair by the window, and watch the mountain do nothing. The silence here was different from the silence at home. At home, silence felt like absence. Here, it felt like pressure. Like the mountain was leaning against the walls. She called Patricia twice. Both times the call ended with Patricia's voice going soft and careful, the way people's voices go when they're managing you rather than talking to you. She stopped calling. She found a journal in one of the kitchen drawers, left by some previous guest, half the pages already used. She read the old entries. A couple who'd stayed here 5 summers in a row. Small notes about trails and wildflowers and a bear they'd spotted near the creek. She recognized the handwriting on the last entry, Harold's, she realized. He'd brought her here once, 15 years ago. She'd forgotten completely. Said the rocks here look like they've been arguing for 1,000 years, he'd written. She's not wrong. But they're still standing. She closed the journal and cried for a very long time. She cried for Harold. She cried for the version of herself she used to be. She cried for the woman who had once stood at the front of lecture halls and commanded attention, and who now sat in a borrowed cottage on a mountain waiting, she thought, to become irrelevant enough to disappear entirely. Then she ran out of tears, the way you run out of a thing you didn't know was finite. And she sat in the quiet. And she was still alive. It was the cold that forced her outside. Not courage. Not hope. Just the fact that the cottage's heating system was old and temperamental, and on the 12th day a pipe in the back wall groaned and a section of baseboard heating simply quit. She spent 2 hours trying to reach a repair service, learned that the nearest one operated on a 3-day wait during November. And then put on every layer she'd brought and walked out the back door into the freezing afternoon air because the cold outside was at least honest about what it was. The mountain behind the cottage rose steeply for about a quarter-mile before leveling into a wide, flat shelf of land surrounded by old-growth pines. She didn't know why she walked toward it. Her hips had been bothering her since October. The ground was uneven, covered in a thin crust of snow over frozen leaves. It was not a sensible walk for a 76-year-old woman alone on a mountain. She did it anyway. When she reached the flat shelf, she stopped. Someone had been building something here. Or had started to, and abandoned it. A low stone wall, maybe 18 inches high, running in an irregular curve around a cleared space of about 30 feet across. Inside the wall, the ground had been partially dug up and flattened. There were stakes in the ground connected by old, weathered string. In the center of the space, under a rough wooden shelter no bigger than a lean-to, she found 3 wooden crates filled with seed packets, most of them ruined by moisture. And 2 tools, a mattock with a cracked handle and a short-handled spade, both rusted but intact. She stood there for a long time, breathing steam into the cold air, looking at this abandoned beginning. She read the seed packets that weren't completely destroyed. Kale. Hardy winter kale. And something labeled simply, mountain garlic, in handwriting she didn't recognize. She picked up the spade. Turned it over in her hands. A garden. Someone had started a garden up here and walked away from it. She told herself she was just curious. She told herself she'd look once and go back inside. She told herself she wasn't the kind of person who gardened, she was a geologist, for heaven's sake. She studied rock. She read fault lines and mineral deposits and the slow grammar of the earth. She did not grow things. But she stood there holding that rusted spade, and something happened in her chest that she hadn't felt in 8 months. Not happiness. Not hope exactly. Just interest. The faint, dangerous ember of wanting to understand something. She carried the spade back to the cottage. The next morning, she went back up. The ground was almost impossible. Even where it had been partially worked before, the soil on this mountain shelf was a geologist's problem, rocky, compressed, layered with clay and shale. Not accustomed to being asked to grow anything other than moss and pine needles. She spent the first morning breaking through 6 inches of frozen crust to find soil that crumbled in clumps like old bread. It was discouraging work. Her hands blistered by the second hour. Her back ached in ways she felt it was indelicate to describe. She did 3 hours that first day and came back to the cottage barely able to lift her arms. She sat in the wooden chair and thought, this is absurd. This is absolutely absurd. But she went back the next morning. And the morning after that. She started studying the space differently, using what she actually knew, the thing that had lived in her head for 31 years. She analyzed the slope of the land, the way snowmelt would run, the direction of morning light between the trees. She knelt down, carefully, slowly, and read the soil the way she used to read rock cores. She found a seam of better earth along the eastern edge where decomposing pine matter had been building up for probably 30 years. Rich, dark, forgiving. She began there. She started small. A bed maybe 4 feet by 8 feet, cleared of rocks by hand, one stone at a time. She stacked the rocks, and there were many, this being, after all, a mountain, along the existing wall, extending it, thickening it. The work was slow. Comically slow by any practical standard. But she found that she didn't mind slowness the way she used to. When you are not going anywhere, slowness changes its character entirely. The seed packets were largely unusable except for 4 that had stayed dry in the corner of one crate, 2 kale, 2 garlic. She planted the garlic first, pressing each clove into the cleared soil with her thumb, then covering the bed with a layer of dead pine needles she raked together with her hands for warmth. The kale would have to wait for a better season or better seed. She wasn't even sure she'd be here for better season. She didn't let herself think about that. But the work came with problems she hadn't anticipated. There was no water source near the shelf. She had to carry water up in 2 old plastic jugs she found in the cottage storage, which meant 2 trips each morning, which meant her hips screamed. There was a deer problem. She found evidence of it in some disturbed soil, and she had no fencing materials. She improvised with rope tied between the stakes and old aluminum foil she twisted into strips, which probably worked the way most improvised solutions work, partially, unreliably. And only because the deer hadn't yet committed. 3 weeks in, she had a productive morning. Cleared a second bed. Extended the wall by 4 feet. Found, remarkably, a patch of something green pushing up near the old shelter. She knelt and examined it and realized it was wild garlic that had naturalized here. Possibly from someone's planting years before. It was alive. It had wintered over and come back. That afternoon she went back to the cottage and called Patricia. Not to complain. Not to be managed. Just to tell someone. Patricia listened and said, "Mom, that's wonderful," in the voice of someone who doesn't quite understand why it's wonderful but senses that it is. After the call, Miriam sat with the journal she'd found, Harold's journal, and she began writing in the empty pages. Not about feelings, not directly. She wrote observations. Soil composition. Drainage patterns. Hours of direct sunlight. Wind direction. The way the mountain ash trees at the edge of the shelf might provide windbreak if she cleared certain growth below them. She was, without quite deciding to be, planning. But then December deepened, and the mountain got serious. 4 days of heavy snowfall buried the garden beds completely. She couldn't work for a week. The garlic was under 2 feet of snow and she had no way to know if it had survived. She found herself standing at the back door, staring up at the shelf she couldn't reach because the path was ice-covered and too dangerous for her to risk. She sat with that for several days. Just that. The not knowing. One night she woke at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark and thought very clearly, what if none of it comes back? What if I did all of that work for nothing? And then, equally clearly, what if that's not actually the point? It was not a comfortable thought. But it was an honest one. She got up and made tea and sat with it until morning. Hollis showed up in mid-December. He came down the eastern path she hadn't known existed, a narrow deer track between the spruce trees, and knocked on her door with the slightly formal manner of someone who lives alone and has not lost their manners despite it. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, tall, weathered in a way that suggested decades outdoors rather than simple age. He was carrying a canvas bag. "Saw your smoke going for a while," he said. "Thought I'd come by." She didn't need company. She wasn't sure she wanted it. But it was 3 degrees outside and he'd walked over a ridge to get here, so she let him in. He was a man of careful, specific words. He'd spent 22 years with the Forestry Service before retiring, and he knew this mountain the way some people know their own hands, not by thinking about it, but by feel. He'd seen her tracks going up to the shelf. "You working on the old Beaumont plot?" he asked. She didn't know what the Beaumont plot was. He explained, a family had owned this land before the current owner, her daughter had arranged the rental, there were ownership layers Miriam had never investigated. 3 generations back, a woman named Dora Beaumont had cultivated a kitchen garden on that shelf. The family had sold the land 20 years ago. The garden had been started again, Hollis thought, by a man who'd rented the cottage a few years back. He came up here after his wife died. Stayed a season. Cleared it out, started planting. Then one day he just didn't come back. Miriam set her tea down. He just left. Sold everything he owned, they say. Moved out west. His daughter told me he said the mountain gave him back something he thought he'd lost. He didn't want to use it up. Hollis shrugged. Some people are like that. She thought about the cracked mattock. The 4 surviving seed packets. Was he a gardener? She asked. No. I think he was a banker. She almost laughed. She actually did, a little, the first real laugh in months, small and rusty, but real. After Hollis left, she went up to the shelf. The snow had compressed somewhat. She could see the rough line of the stone wall she'd extended, buried but present, like a thought you don't quite lose. She dug down with her hands near the eastern bed and found, 6 inches down, the dark soil she'd worked. And there, under the snow, the faintest thread of green. 1 garlic shoot. Coming up through frozen ground in December on a mountain in Vermont, as if nobody had told it this was impossible. She knelt there for a long time. Her knees hurt. The cold came up through her coat and into her bones. She didn't care. She was not a sentimental woman. She had spent her life in the company of rocks, which take the long view, which are not moved by seasons or by grief or by the smallness of human drama. She knew, professionally, that this was just a plant doing what plants do, following chemical signals and pressure gradients and ancient biological imperatives. But she pressed her palm against the snow beside that green thread and felt something move through her. Not comfort exactly. Something older than comfort. It doesn't know the odds, she thought. It just grows. She went back to the cottage and opened the journal and wrote for 2 hours straight. January and February were hard in ways she'd expected and ways she hadn't. She built a cold frame, or something approximating one, out of old window glass she found in the cottage storage and scrap lumber from a broken shelf. It was structurally questionable. Hollis came by twice a week now, sometimes with supplies from town, sometimes just for the company that both of them pretended was incidental. He helped her reinforce the cold frame without being asked, in the manner of people who understand that some help is best offered silently. She ordered seed catalogs. They arrived forwarded from her Vermont address, and she read them with the focused intensity she used to bring to journal articles. She wrote notes in the margins. She made decisions about soil amendment, ordered a bag of agricultural lime to address the acidity, ordered bone meal, ordered compost that she'd have to carry up the path. She called Patricia more often. Differently than before. Not longer calls, but fuller ones. She talked about the soil composition on the shelf. About the way the mountain ash blocked the worst of the western wind. About the garlic that had come up through December snow and was now, under the cold frame, tentatively thriving. Patricia said, quietly, on one of these calls, "Mom, I haven't heard you like this in a long time." Miriam didn't ask what like this meant. She thought she knew. She started sleeping better. Not perfectly, she was 76 and her body had its own complaints and she was not going to pretend otherwise, but better. She started eating more regularly, not because anyone told her to but because the work demanded fuel in a way that sitting in a chair did not. She noticed this about herself and found it interesting rather than consoling. She made mistakes. She overwatered the early kale starts she'd nursed inside on the cottage windowsill and killed 4 of 6. She put in a second garlic bed and used soil that she hadn't worked enough and nothing came up. She spent 3 days building a simple rain collection system with a barrel and roof gutters, and it worked well for 2 weeks, and then a February freeze cracked the barrel. Each failure was instructive. That was the part she hadn't expected, that she would fail at this the way she'd failed at things earlier in her life. With exasperation and energy and the particular stubbornness of someone who takes failure as information rather than verdict. She had not expected to feel like herself again. She had not expected the self she found to be quite so recognizable. By March, she had 4 raised beds established on the eastern side of the shelf. She'd used the stacked stones not just for windbreak but for thermal mass. They absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, warming the soil slightly. This was not gardening knowledge. This was geology. It was the same principle at work in cliff faces and canyon walls and every rock formation she'd studied for 30 years. The mountain was teaching her things using a language she already spoke. She began giving Hollis surplus seedlings. He didn't grow things either. He was a forester, interested in trees, not vegetables, but he planted them with the cooperative spirit of a man who understands reciprocity. She taught him what she'd learned about the soil on the ridge. He taught her which paths were safe in which weather. They ate lunch together on Tuesdays on the cottage porch, neither of them talking much, both of them comfortable in the silence in a way that had taken several months to earn. In April, Patricia came up. She'd driven up on a Saturday without making a large announcement of it, which Miriam appreciated. She arrived to find her mother in mud-covered boots and an old field jacket, coming down the path from the shelf carrying a trug of small tools and talking, not to herself. Miriam explained, but to the mountain. "You narrate," she said to Patricia simply. "It helps you notice things." Patricia walked up to the shelf with her. Stood at the edge of the stone wall and looked at what was there, the 4 beds, the cold frame, the lean-to reinforced with new lumber, the rain barrel, the second one, better installed. The orderly stacks of river stones sorted by size along the wall. The garlic was up 8 inches and green in a way that seemed, at altitude in Vermont in April, almost unreasonable in its confidence. Patricia didn't say much for a long time. Then she said, "She built this." She said it the way you say something when you're not talking to anyone in particular but to the world in general, to register that something real has happened. "She's still building it," Miriam said. In late May, Hollis brought something up the path. A wooden box, old, the wood gray with age and moisture. He'd found it in his storage shed, he said. It had been left by the previous owners of his land years ago. He thought it might belong to the cottage's history, and since Miriam seemed to be the one most invested in that history now, she should have it. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, a journal. Older than the one she'd found in the kitchen drawer. Much older. The handwriting on the cover read, "Garden Notes, D.M. Beaumont, 1947 to 1963. Dora Beaumont." She sat on the porch and read it over 3 days. Dora had started her mountain garden in 1947. She'd been 63 years old. Her husband had died 2 years before. Her children, grown and scattered to cities, had suggested in the gentle, relentless way of concerned children that she should come down from the mountain and live nearer to them. She had not. She had walked up to the shelf behind her cottage, the same shelf, the same clay soil, the same obstinate mountain, and she had begun to build something. The journal was not dramatic. It was functional. Soil temperatures. First frost dates. What worked? What didn't? Failures recorded without self-pity. Successes noted with a dry satisfaction that Miriam recognized immediately, the way you recognize a stranger's handwriting and realize it looks like yours. One entry near the end, 1963, Dora would have been 79, read, North Bed is the best it's ever been. 16 years of working this ground and it finally understands what I want. Or I finally understand what it needs. Not sure which. Possibly they are the same thing. The journal ended there. Not dramatically. Just ended. As if she'd simply gone inside and made tea. Miriam sat with this for a long time. 3 women. Or perhaps more, perhaps there were others in between, others who had sat with that view and picked up a tool and decided to begin. Each one arriving at this place in some version of the same condition, set aside. Outlived certain chapters. Placed at the edge of the story by people who loved them but could not quite hold them. Each one, without consultation, without any knowledge of the others, making the same decision. Not to overcome grief. Not to perform recovery. Not to prove something to anyone. Just to begin. On a mountain that didn't care about their age or their loss or whether anyone was watching. To press something into the cold ground and wait and come back and wait. She thought about what Hollis had told her, the banker who'd come after his wife died and then disappeared west, leaving the tools behind. She thought about him coming up to this shelf, finding Dora's wall, maybe not knowing what it was, just feeling the shape of something intentional in the land and following it. She thought about herself, cold and empty and 76, picking up that rusted spade. None of them had been gardeners. That wasn't the point. The point was that the mountain held this particular quality of solitude, not empty solitude, but full solitude. The kind that strips you down to what you actually are when no one is expecting anything from you. And in that stripping, something stubborn and specific and yours tends to surface. Some version of yourself that predates all the roles, the wife, the mother, the professor, the patient, the burden, the woman being managed. Just the person. Just the hands in the soil. Just the question of what this particular plot of ground might grow. She turned to the last empty page of Dora's journal and wrote, M. Caldwell. 76, May. Garlic doing well. Second planting of kale survived. The north wall needs another course of stones, I'll do that Thursday. The mountain still doesn't care who I am. I find this, increasingly, to be a relief. She didn't move back to Vermont that autumn. She didn't announce this decision dramatically. She simply didn't pack. She renewed the rental. She ordered seed catalogs for the following year. She called Patricia and told her, and Patricia was quiet in a way that was not the managed quiet, it was the quiet of someone recalibrating. Understanding that the situation was not what she'd thought it was. Are you happy up there, Mom? It was a real question. Miriam gave it a real answer. I'm not sure happy is the right word. I'm engaged. I'm interested. I'm doing things that are hard and failing at some of them and learning from the failure. She paused. I think for a while, I'd stopped being interested in anything. I thought that was grief. Maybe it was. But I think I confused the grief with the end. Patricia said, it wasn't the end. No, Miriam said. It wasn't. In October, she harvested the garlic. 47 heads. More than she could use. She gave most of it to Hollis, who gave some to his daughter in town, who gave some to a woman who ran a small community kitchen, who called Miriam to ask if she had more. She did not, that season. She would, the next. The shelf on the mountain, Dora's shelf, the banker's shelf, Miriam's shelf, had been abandoned and returned to twice in living memory. And now it would be returned to again in the spring. By a woman who had been brought to a mountain to disappear quietly and had instead started reading the earth like a text she'd spent her whole life preparing to understand. She still talked to the mountain. It still didn't answer back. She had stopped needing it to. There is a kind of forgetting that happens to people who grow old, not the forgetting they do, but the forgetting that is done to them. Gradually, incrementally, by people who mean well and are busy and are simply caught in the current of their own lives. The old are moved to quieter places. Their edges are softened by careful management. They are loved, often genuinely, in the way that valuable things are loved when they are no longer in use, protected, preserved, kept from harm. But Miriam Caldwell found something in a rusted spade on a mountain in November that no careful management could have given her. She found the part of herself that had never needed permission to begin. And so the question this story leaves us with is not about age, or grief, or even survival. It's simpler than that. What have you abandoned on the shelf, not because you ran out of time, but because someone, somewhere, made you believe your beginning days were behind you? Because the ground does not check your age before it accepts the seed. It only asks if you're willing to kneel down.